George Brandis, SC, Senator for Queensland, Shadow Attorney General, Shadow Minister for Arts, Deputy Leader of the Opposition in the Senate. And can I welcome you? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ellis. Can I acknowledge you and members of your board and members of the Council of the Humanities, the Arts and Social Sciences. And I should acknowledge, even though she's left, my colleague and friend across party lines, Kate Lundy. It is a great pleasure to make some opening remarks at this inaugural National Forum of Chas. As some in this room may know, I myself come from a background in the humanities as both a student and as a university teacher before I was a practicing lawyer. And so I hope the social scientists will forgive me, but it is on the humanities that I propose to focus my remarks. I care deeply about the role of the humanities and social sciences and their enduring relevance. In coming weeks in Sydney, there will be held what has become one of the fixtures on the Sydney intellectual calendar, the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. Today, I want to talk to you about a dangerous idea, too little discussed in contemporary Australian education. That dangerous idea is the past. You meet at a time when almost all of the debate about education, both school education and higher education, seems to be about funding. While policy decisions are almost always, in the end, decisions about resource allocation, funding alone is not the only thing that matters in achieving excellence in education. As my colleague, the Shadow Minister for Education, Christopher Pyne, has recently pointed out, the quality of teaching and the content of the curriculum are also important. And while the capacity of schools and universities to attract first-class teachers is, at least in part, a function of resources, the content of curricula is not. As you know, I am not the Shadow Minister for Education, and other than reassuring you, Bill Shorten-like, that I agree with everything Christopher Pyne says and everything that he has ever said and everything that he ever will say, I do want to use the time available to me to make one point about the curriculum, which is, I think, of particular importance to the teaching of the humanities. And I hope to err on the side of being provocative so as to inform your thinking in the days ahead. It is now 25 years since Alan Bloom published his remarkable book, The Closing of the American Mind. Offensive to many people, inspiring to many more, it became something of a minor cultural phenomenon. Chief among the many vices against which it warned had beset the humanities in America was the apparently deliberate narrowing of the humanities curriculum by the abandonment, or at least the diminishing, of the traditional canon of classical texts in preference to the great works of history, of literature, of philosophy. Bloom warned against the emergence of a narrow and conceited modernism which regarded the scholarship of the past with disdain. I believe that what Bloom wrote 25 years ago was largely true then, and my sense of Australian humanities departments in the intervening quarter century is that the phenomenon against which he warned is actually worse today than it was in 1987. While the physical sciences, and to an extent the social sciences, are based upon empirical inquiry so that the most recent advances in knowledge may almost always be accounted the most important, that cannot be said in the case of the humanities. There is absolutely no reason to believe for instance, that the literature of the 20th century, or the 21st century, is intrinsically more important or valuable or relevant than the literature of the 19th or of the 17th, or indeed of the literature of classical antiquity. If anything, the reverse is true. I recently read Middlemarch for the first time. Although in the course of the last 40 years, I suppose I've read most of the classics of 20th century English and American fiction, I cannot readily think of anything written in English in the last century which rivals its psychological depth, subtlety, and range. Yet in many English departments, the preferences of an infantile, self-obsessed modernism sees the displacement of most of the great classics of the 19th century by shallow works recommended only by their so-called contemporary relevance. In history departments, study of some of the most important ages of European, American, or Asian history is swept aside in favour of studies which can be described as niche at best. And at a time when the number of governments in the world which proclaim themselves to be Marxist can be counted in single figures, there are few politics departments which do not continue to devote an almost obsessive attention to Marxism, yet pay relatively little regard to more important political philosophers like John Locke or Adam Smith, whose ideas have stood the test of time. Whose intellectual influence has been more important, for example, in shaping the Catholic nations of South America? Karl Marx or St. Augustine? And yet one would look in vain for the City of God on the curriculum of any Australian politics or philosophy department, while third or fourth-rate Marxist detritus seems to litter every reading list. To eliminate the great works from the curriculum, or at least deliberately to devalue their importance, to deny to today's humanities students a critical understanding of the classics, is an act of intellectual vandalism akin to the burning of libraries. In 1911, A.E. Housman gave the inaugural lecture at Cambridge upon his election as the Kennedy Professor of Latin. Today, Housman is remembered, if at all, as the author of the elegant, yearning poetry of A Shropshire Lad, so beloved of the Edwardians. But although he won fame as a poet, Housman was, first and foremost, a classical scholar of exceptional distinction and severe dignity, who embodied the uncompromising intellectual integrity which used to be the hallmark of true scholarship. In the Kennedy lecture, he spoke of the threat posed to scholarship by superficial minds which, if I may quote him, command no outlook upon the past or the future, but believe that the fashion of the present, unlike all fashions heretofore, will endure perpetually, and that their own flimsy tabernacle of second-hand opinions is a habitation for everlasting. And not content with believing these improbable things, he despises those who do not believe them, and displays to the world that stiff and self-righteous arrogance of the unthinking man, which ages ago provoked this sentence from Solomon: "The sluggard is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason." What Housman was warning against was what I call the vanity of the present. As he said, it is not to be supposed that this age, because it happens to be ours, has been specially endowed with a gift denied to all others. And he went on to say, in words which I offer for your consideration, I spoke just now of the servility shown towards the living, and I think it significant that this is so often found in company with lack of veneration towards the dead. My counsel is to invert this attitude and to think more of the dead than the living. The dead have at any rate endured a test to which the living have not yet been subjected. If a man, 50 or 100 years after his death, is still remembered and accounted a great man, there is a presumption in his favour which no living man can claim. And experience has taught me that it is no mere presumption. It is the dead and not the living who have most advanced our learning and science. And though their knowledge may have been superseded, there is no supersession of reason or intelligence. Clear wits and right thinking are essentially neither of today nor of yesterday, but historically they are rather of yesterday than of today. And to study the greatest of the scholars of the past is to enjoy intercourse with superior minds. If our conception of scholarship and our methods of procedure are at variance with theirs, it is not indeed a certainty or a necessity that we are wrong, but it is a good working hypothesis, and we had better not abandon it till it proves to be untenable. Do not let us disregard our contemporaries, but let us regard our predecessors more. Let us be most encouraged by their agreement and most disquieted by their dissent. Well, so said A.E. Housman in illustrating his point that there is no a priori reason to believe that this age is endowed with a superior wisdom merely because we happen to inhabit it. So how do we guard against that fatal conceit? Unless we are happy to live in ignorance, then reverence not of the past for its own sake, but of the great minds of the past, whose work has stood the test of time, is not the least important attribute which our modern teachers of the humanities can bring to shaping the minds of our students and perpetuating the Western canon. Thank you.